This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Wow, this house is cute. But can I really get in the game in this economy? I do have savings, and I am responsible-ish. I should bury it. I'm being wild. But what if I'm not being wild, though? Could I actually score a...
Kick off your home buying journey with Zillow's new BuyAbility tool. It makes it easy to find out what you can afford, so you can get off the bench and onto the playing field with confidence. Check your BuyAbility, only on Zillow.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with a Business Unlimited smartphone plan. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second internet plan with savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
Remember the days when you knew you were going to have a good school day because the movie player got wheeled in? Well, if you're of a certain age, the movie player may mean 2 hours of a deranged, violent, potentially not appropriate adaptation of a literary classic that your teacher has zero desire to reread. Remember to stick your gum under the table before your jaw hits the ground as we attempt to prove to you that Lord of the Rings from 1978 is not that bad. Welcome, one and all to It's Not That Bad, the podcast that looks for A grades and B movies, and a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network. Hello to all of our listeners in Royal Oak, Michigan, and around the world. How are you guys doing today? Okay, we don't normally tackle animated films on this show, but every now and then get a request, get a suggestion, and the idea is too delicious to avoid. So when Matt Larder joined in and said, "Hey, how do you feel about doing Lord of the Rings, but the animated version?" I'm like, okay, I'm down for this challenge. And then a flashback that I remember watching The Hobbit, the animated one, in school, but I didn't remember Lord of the Rings. So it was definitely worth going back down and trying to find that. But Matt, welcome to the show. How are you doing, man?
Hey, I am doing great, Jason. Thanks so much for having me. It's really fun to be here. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Now, dear listeners, if Matt's voice sounds slightly familiar, that's because technically speaking, this isn't Matt's first appearance on the show. If you listened to our live taping of Ophelia, Matt chimed in with an MVP pick at the end. So now Matt has to go through the full excursion of going through this. So I ask you, since you brought this film to the table, what is it about this one that made you want to go down this road?
Well, I mean, in general, I'm a Tolkien fan, right? I'm a big fan of that whole universe, the Peter Jackson films, the books, the extended books. And I honestly couldn't remember if I'd seen this movie before. I think, way back, 25 years ago, I think I did. But it popped into my head when I was giving it some thought one day. And I just thought, I really like Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and that kind of thing, but I'm pretty sure this was going to be a movie that was going to fit your list. So that's kind of what gave me the idea.
Yeah. And it's funny because as I'm looking at this, initially I'm like, oh, okay, Lord of the Rings should be okay. And then I have to remind myself that as much of a geek as I am, this is where it's confession time, dear listeners. The geek that you listen to on a regular basis, have never read any of the Tolkien novels, have never seen any of the Peter Jackson movies, nor have I watched the Rings of Power series on Amazon Prime. In fact, the only Lord of the Rings property that I have ever actually watched in full because it was movie day in school was the 1977 Hobbit animated film as done by Rankin Bass. So I feel this is going to be very, very interesting because I'm coming at this having an okay idea. It's not like this is foreign territory for me completely because I know the story-ish, but I'm coming in not having read the books or watched any. Like, this is somewhat new for me.
Well, I think that's kind of interesting because you're coming at it from a purely, how they made the film point of view then, whereas I'm looking at it for story content and kind of how that all translates. So I think that's kind of interesting having those different points of view.
Well, and that's the nice thing about this is that if you have two people who are fans of a property and they're coming at it from the same point of view, then it's going to be a very one-sided, yet from two people conversation. So hopefully these points of view will lead to some very interesting discussions. But those discussions are going to come in a little bit because we have some business on the table here. Because before we get to that point, we need to take the 1978 animated Lord of the Rings and trailerize it.
From the mind that brought you classy, family-oriented animated fare, like Fritz the Cat, and the coolest version of Robin Hood ever because there were jetpacks involved, comes an animated take of one of the greatest fantasy series ever written. But it's 1978, so it's going to look dark, menacing, and bloody because 70s animated movies were not a safe space for anybody. Featuring an all-star thespian voice cast and an animation style that will never allow you to sleep again, this film looks to do in one movie what J.R.R. Tolkien needed 3 books to do, which is why they didn't actually finish the damn story. Making this just like real life because you probably fell asleep before reaching the end of the book anyways. John Hurt and Anthony Daniels bring page to screen in The Lord of the Rings. Rated PG for penciled in Gollum.
That's fantastic.
Oh man. It's kind of hard to separate. And again, I've seen parts of the Peter Jackson films. It's kind of hard to separate the epicness that was what Peter Jackson was able to put on screen and then flash back to 1978. But the funny thing is, I mean, I am of that certain age. I remember when the movie machine came in and it was an actual film camera or film projector because I'm old as dirt. But the thing is, I had to remind myself just what the 70s and early 80s animated films were like because they weren't all Disney-esque. This came out in 1978, the same year as Watership Down. And anyone who has seen that film knows it is darkish.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you guys thought that the rabbits in Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail were tough? No. Watership Down is not messing around.
I was never really a runner. The way I see running is a gift, especially when you have stage 4 cancer. I'm Anne. I'm running the Boston Marathon, presented by Bank of America. I run for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to give people like me a chance to thrive in life, even with cancer.
Join Bank of America in helping Anne's cause. Give if you can at BofA.com/supportAnne. What would you like the power to do? References to charitable organizations is not an endorsement by Bank of America Corporation. Copyright 2025.
This episode is brought to you by Walmart. New beauty is in bloom at Walmart, and it's all about springtime radiance. From Drybar, Tula Skincare, and hundreds more available online, Walmart has the premium brands you want and this season's on-trend products for flawless, glossy hair and hydrated skin. Big name beauty brands? Check. The things you love? Check. Find trending spring beauty and all you need to look and feel gorgeous at Walmart, on app and online.
Springfest at Lowe's means can't miss savings for your home and lawn. Right now, buy 3 bags, get 3 free on Miracle-Gro 3/4 cubic foot all-purpose garden soil. Plus, buy 2, get 1 free on select exterior paint and stain via mail-in rebate. Lowe's, we help, you save. Valid through 4/16. Excludes Alaska and Hawaii. While supplies last, selection varies by location. See rebate form for complete list of eligible products. Offer excludes clearance and mistints and can't be combined with any other offer, promotion, discount, or coupon.
But let's get into this movie. The movie stars Christopher Guard, William Squire, Michael Scholes, Sir John Hurt, Simon Chandler, Dominic Guard, Norman Bird, Michael Graham Cox, Anthony Daniels, David Buck, Peter Woodthorpe, and more. However, there is an almost starring in this one. Actually approaching the producer and director, Ralph Bakshi, to play the roles of Frodo and Aragorn were Mick Jagger and David Carradine. Mick Jagger?
Yeah, I had no idea.
Mick Jagger is Frodo. And David Carradine is Aragorn. Or even if you reverse those ideas, like, huh? I mean, I get it. It's Lord of the Rings. And Mick Jagger and David Carradine can pretty much call their own shot. But they had already asked after the lines had already been recorded. So why re-record them?
Mm-hmm.
Also, originally cast as Gandalf was Alan Napier. Now, he's probably best known from the Adam West Batman TV series. He was Alfred, but then the production moved to England, and then the cost of keeping Alan Napier on the cast was apparently too much. This film was directed by Ralph Bakshi. As mentioned in the trailer eyes, he's the guy who brought us Fritz the Cat, which was one of the first adult animated films. I remember watching Fritz the Cat going, what the am I watching? 70s brought some drugs to the screen, let me tell you. But I'm going to show my age here again. If you're Canadian and you are of a certain vintage, these next three words are going to bring back some memories. Rocket Robin Hood. And if you've never watched Rocket Robin Hood, you are missing out on something. But the funny thing is, he also directed and produced seasons 2 and 3 of the original Spider-Man animated TV series. And we know you all watch that one because Spider-Man does whatever. Now it's song stuck in your head and I'm not sorry at all. But he also directed Cool World for those of you who are maybe a little bit younger. This was released 1 year after the Hobbit animated film, but that one was actually done by Rankin and Bass. Rankin Bass is the company that gave us Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, like the classic, silver and gold, that freaking Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And then they went into The Hobbit. Looking at the crew list, listed in the animation team, but apparently his job was just to dust off the animation cells. So this is an early job in his career. Tim Burton was actually part of the crew on this film. Not a big part, but he was there. Also, this film almost featured the music of Led Zeppelin, but Bakshi couldn't get the rights to it. So that would have been interesting. That definitely would have been interesting.
Well, that really would have been something. I mean, there's a lot of music in the film already, kind of at a lot of the action and conflict parts, and it would have been, I don't know if it would have been out of place to hear Led Zeppelin in this film, but it would have been cool for sure.
Right now, I just want someone to take this film and make a music video to like Over the Hills and Far Away, or there are so many Zeppelin songs that this could have worked for. And I understand why he wanted to use it, because obviously Zeppelin was influenced by some fantasy series elements in some of their songs for sure. The film had a budget of $4 million. Worldwide, actually made $30 million. On opening weekend in 1978, it only made $626,649, but that was 1978. But let me give you a bigger picture of this, because we are talking about animated films. In the year 1978, this is the second highest grossing film of animated movies released that year at that $30,471,420. The number one highest grossing animated film to be released in 1978 was released in Japan. Farewell to Space Battleship Yamato which brought in 4,300,000,000 yen, which equates to about $43 million US. Now, this is, of course, all according to Wikipedia. I'm sure there's something in the exchange rate. But there were some accolades for this film. At the 1979 Saturn Awards, it was nominated for Best Fantasy Film, lost to Heaven Can Wait. At the 1979 Golden Globes, Leonard Rosenman was nominated for Best Original Score for this film, lost to Midnight Express. And at the 1979 Hugo Awards, it was nominated for Best Dramatic Presentation, lost to Superman. And I don't hate that, because it's Superman and it's Christopher Reeve. But the reason why we're here, and not just because Matt has fantastic taste in films, are the critics. Over at Rotten Tomatoes, this film has a tomatometer of 49% and a popcorn meter of 64%. But to give you the bigger picture, at Metacritic, it has a Metascore of 51. At IMDb, it sits at 6.2 stars out of 10. At Letterboxd, it sits at 3.2 stars out of 5, giving this a 64% score. And at the movie database, it sits at 66. So, this film has an aggravated aggregate of 59.33%. So it is still a college fail, but very, very, very barely. But the interesting thing is, you take a look at all the numbers, they're pretty much all in line in that 50 to 60%. Is that how you see this film?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there were definitely elements of it that made it, good enough to, as you say, pass, get that kind of 50, 55. But I mean, it wasn't spectacular enough to do anything higher than that to me, right? I think I can agree with that as a general rule.
Now, keeping in mind that The Hobbit was the film that's probably shown in schools quite a bit because, as made by Rankin and Bass, they made it kid-friendly. This is not that. But I want to give you guys the comparables, though. That Hobbit film that was released in 1977 on Rotten Tomatoes sits at a 71% tomatometer with a 65% popcorn meter. And the sequel that Ralph Bakshi could not make because the performance of this didn't allow him to. Rankin and Bass did The Return of the King, 67% tomatometer, but a 39% popcorn meter. That's a massive drop.
That does kind of surprise me. I mean, I would have thought that would have gone up, especially with the other numbers that you quoted there. But that's surprising.
Well, the interesting thing here is that when The Hobbit came out, this is obviously like one of the first takes on a series that really the film and technology world was not ready to do Lord of the Rings in the 70s. It just was not going to work. I say that knowing that I have watched the music video by Leonard Nimoy of The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins. And if you have not watched this video, please go to our website at notthatbadcast.com and go to the episode page for the show. I'm going to post the link, and you're never going to watch Star Trek the same again, because this... Ooh. The song's a bop. It's a catchy as hell earworm bop. But the video is so... we mentioned the Adam West Batman TV series earlier. You thought the Bat-Toozy was some bad dancing? Ballad of Bilbo Baggins, people. Just watch the video and thank me, or I'll say sorry later, one of the two. But the thing is, the film world wasn't ready to make a live-action Lord of the Rings film. And The Hobbit, as done by Rankin and Bass, it was an ambitious take, but it wasn't too bad. This was an ambitious take and went in a very different direction. So then, The Return of the King, you now have two different animation studios doing this. And I think the fact that the popcorn meter sits roughly about the same for both, but yet drops heavily for The Return of the King, I wonder how much of that is knowing what it could have been. Because if people liked The Lord of the Rings and you want to continue in that vein and not go back to the kiddie-esque version of The Hobbit, it's got to be a bit of a letdown. I think to Todd Phillips' first Joker film, and people were like, this is amazing. Joaquin Phoenix has brought a brand new Joker to the screen, and it's awesome, and it's dark, and it's exactly what the Joker needs to be. And then Folie à Deux came out. And it no longer was. Like, the sequel has a backlash effect on the original. I wonder if the sequel for Return of the King has a backlash effect on The Hobbit because of the existence of Lord of the Rings. Something we can talk about a little bit later, but let's get into this film. Because this is an animated movie, we can't really get too much into the individual actors because, well, it's a voice cast. But your take on the voice cast as a whole?
I mean, I think in general it was decent. The biggest thing that I noticed kind of throughout the film for me, across a lot of the voices, was a lot of a lack of emotion. Kind of at heightened emotional scenes, it sounded fairly monotone. And then at other times, I think it was really good. It was really good, kind of back and forth, kind of friendly, welcoming tones in that kind of in that when the scene called for it. But then when it called for a heightened emotion, I think of the scene where kind of Galadriel was doing the bit with the mirror, and she's doing the whole you would have it the evil queen thing. I forget the exact quote that she says. Her voice stays pretty monotone the whole time, and I noticed that throughout. It's just kind of the heightened emotional parts, if you will.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when they were recording this, they would actually take a beat in between lines of dialogue when they were kind of handing things off to each other because of audio mixing purposes after the fact. So it's one of those things where it probably felt a little bit stilted, because if we had this, conversation and I would have a long pause and then you would chime in and then have a long pause. And I'm sure everyone has seen this. If watch the news, and when you have someone on satellite from like the other side of the world, there's going to be a transmission delay. And it's that awkward moment of must stay quiet, wait for them to answer. Yeah, you have to think that that's kind of in that vein, because voice actors, when they're working at the same time, they can kind of feed off of each other. But if you're forced to take a break in between sentences, that's going to pull some of the energy out of it, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I have to remember, and we have to remember, this was a 70s, film, and the voice acting that they were doing then is, you can't look at it through the lens of the 2020s and, and kind of the advancements rather that have been made. So that does make some sense in what you're saying.
The other thing too is that nowadays, what you can do is, do the voice work, and then of course they'll animate everything around it. And the animation levels have gone on to become so good. And then of course you can go back and do a little bit of ADR and if need be. They try to keep the budget low on this. As I'm watching this though, one thing really, really stood out, because again, in hindsight, there's going to be those comparables to the Peter Jackson movies. Peter Woodthorpe, who voiced Gollum in this, you have to remember that this Gollum came first, and I wonder if Andy Serkis listened to this and took cues from it to create his own Gollum voice.
I agree. I thought the same thing. I thought that a number of elements of the Peter Jackson films borrowed from this one. You could see it in either kind of exact dialogue some of the characters had in the films that would come later, but also in shots that they would use. There was a shot, I think, when they were in Bree through the window looking at the beds. That was exactly the same shot that Peter Jackson would go on to use when he made his film. And I did notice that a number of times. I think there was a lot of maybe borrowing from how this movie was set up and the things that they liked when then Peter Jackson would go on to make his films.
Yeah, and Jackson did actually acknowledge that there were a few moments from these films that, if not influenced, but kind of made their way into his films. And then there's a couple of names that stand out in this cast. Of course, I'm a Star Wars geek, and I've said this on the show many, many times. Knowing that Anthony Daniels, the voice of C-3PO, is Legolas, and then you listen to it, and this is funny because knowing it's Anthony Daniels, I'm like, ooh, where's that C-3PO sound? Doesn't really sound like C-3PO here, but I think in this case, that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And if I hadn't known that beforehand, then I wouldn't have noticed. right? That Anthony Daniels, that it was the same guy, right? If I was coming into it without knowing who he was, but I agree because I don't think it's a great idea to kind of cross those two kind of fantasy orbs too much. You may have some fans that carry over and recognize the voice and go, oh, I kind of like that, but I think it is better to keep them separate.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, this is actually the second Ralph Bakshi Star Wars connection. Prior to this film, he did an animated film called Wizards and basically made a deal with Lucas that Mark Hamill could do some voice work for that film. So Wizards is actually the film debut of Mark Hamill, not Star Wars, even though they were done around the same time. But it's when you have such an iconic voice, and keeping in mind too that really there was only one Star Wars out at this time. So this iconic level for Anthony Daniels' voice work is very much in hindsight. I'm glad it's not the same tenor. You have that now with Jack Black. Anytime he voices an animated character, it's Jack Black in animation form. And it kind of gets a little repetitive, especially with how much Jack Black does. Anthony Daniels, while mostly known for C-3PO work, kind of hid in the character of Legolas. And I think that's key here.
No, I agree. And I think, again, it was early on in his work. I think he had no idea how iconic his C-3PO role was going to grow into. So, you could understand it as him maybe just trying to do, not the same thing every time, kind of show kind of the range that he has. And I think if that was his goal, then he definitely achieved it here.
And then there's Sir John Hurt as Aragorn. And, I'm partial to John Hurt because he's the war doctor and I'm a Doctor Who geek. I make no bones about it. Of all the cast in this, John Hurt's voice, I think, stands out amongst everybody else. And that, obviously it's John frickin' Hurt. So of course he has the gravitas to put to this, but Aragorn is a huge role in this. And I think it's voiced very well.
I agree. I think if they were going to give somebody of, you said gravitas, right? Somebody with that, Aragorn was the right role to give it to, right? He comes right out in this one and kind of admits, early on, hey, I'm Aragorn, I'm, the king to be, that kind of thing. They don't do it subtly like they do in the Peter Jackson ones. And it builds his character up right away as being important. And if you're going to give that role to anyone, it should be somebody like that.
Oh, absolutely. The funny thing too is that as a cast, and I'm watching this film, and every now and then when I'm watching, I'll sit down and I'll start taking notes. And I realized after a bit that there were times when I wasn't necessarily watching the film, I was listening to the film. You could literally take this movie, strip the video, and turn it into an audiobook or an audio play, and I think it still works exactly as it's recorded.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I think you're absolutely right. Mostly because the first time I started watching it, that's what I ended up doing. Was kind of, it was late, but closing my eyes and listening to it. I noticed a lot of the time there were just kind of instrumental or kind of long musical parts that were, I don't want to say hard to watch because they weren't. It wasn't like it was difficult to see what was on the screen, but there was just a lot of colors going on and that kind of thing. So it if you strip that away and just listen to it, keep the music the way it was, it would work quite well.
Yeah. Any audio play or audiobook that's done with a full production and a full cast and full sound design, it can absolutely work really, really well. And I think they had the makings of a damn good BBC radio play in this. And really, if you don't do this as an animated film, an audio play is really the only other way to do The Lord of the Rings in the 70s because it's just not feasible to put on the screen the epic vision that Tolkien had written.
Well, that's absolutely true. And I think, given what they did produce, and they did what they could for the time, and what they came out with was not a terrible product, but it is very descriptive with the audio, like you said, right? So if you were just listening to it, it's not like a lot of films today where you have to be seeing what's going on and they don't always tell you, right? They were telling you what was going on the entire time in this film, whether it was the characters describing it or the narrator who popped in and there. I mean, halfway through the film, I forgot there was a narrator until he popped back in. But it was very, very verbally descriptive. It didn't lean quite as heavily on the visual element, which again is a sign of it being the late 70s.
Yeah. Funny enough, if you were to watch the trailer for this film, the voice work for that trailer is done by none other than Orson Welles. But I'm sure it would have cost way too much money for Orson Welles to be the narrator of the film, especially if you're trying to keep things on a budget. Also, remember that the last ever role for Orson Welles was as Unicron in Transformers the movie. But I'm a Transformers geek. I'm going to bring that up every time I get a chance to. So just be ready for it. The animation style of this film, if it looks weird, it's because you're used to The Hobbit. They use a technique called rotoscoping. So what they do with rotoscoping is they actually shoot the scenes in black and white with actual physical actors. And then they take that back in and they trace over the scenes. That's how they actually did the animated scene in Guardians of the Galaxy, the holiday special. They rotoscoped it. But not everything in this film is rotoscoped, because you have some scenes where, yeah, they shot it and whatnot, and then they solarized and color treated it. So there are times when it looks like rotoscope hand-drawn animation, and there are times when it looks like a really, really weird black and white film where they just basically spilled a bunch of paint on the film, on the actual film strip. What was your thought on the shifting of the animation styles in this?
Honestly, it took a little bit to get used to. I really liked the opening, the prologue, where they kind of just did the shadowy kind of figures. I thought that was well done, and it opened up into the what I'm going to call maybe more normal or more natural looking animation, and that was all right off the start. It was when it got into that kind of messy, I thought sometimes it was just like watercolor paints getting thrown all over the screen, and that was a little bit harder to follow, especially because those scenes were longer. And it was a lot of the travel scenes or some of the fight scenes when it was like that. So it was kind of loud music, and it was just kind of felt like they were throwing colors at you, which was an interesting choice. I mean, it definitely made the film a little darker, I think, maybe, but it was difficult sometimes to transition back and forth between the two animation styles.
Yeah, I mean, at first it's like, okay, it's rotoscoping, it's all good, it's no worries. And then they get to like the pub scene where all of a sudden you have Frodo's like dancing on the table, and you got a bunch of drunks that are sitting around and clapping and dancing, and I'm like, they look really, really freaking creepy. And seeing the two styles on the screen at the same time, it throws you for a loop if you're not ready for it. But then you have the ring wraiths, and they just look like nightmare fuel.
They really did. And I mean, the Peter Jackson films did a good job of making them look terrifying. These ones look scarier because they just kind of look like, I'm not entirely sure what they were going for, but when you would see them kind of be beneath the robes, it was just kind of these melted, twisted, kind of grotesque, human-esque. With that animation style on top of it, they kind of made them look like cardboard cutouts at the same time, and it was. It was definitely scary, which I think is what they were going for at the time, but it was a little bit hard to follow.
Yeah, and it can be hard sometimes too when you have like the background changing while the foreground is staying the same, and I get that happened as well in Fritz the Cat, 1972 film done by Ralph Bakshi as well. But you had to do things in order to be able to keep your budget down, because if you're up against a tight budget, you do what you have to do. And I think in the case of like characters like the ring wraiths, it works really well because it gives them a more surrealness. And even like the massive fights on horseback scenes, it's like, this is different. It's dark. It's very dark. And that's the thing people have to remind themselves. when Rankin Bass released The Hobbit, they did it in a way that, yeah, you could show it in schools. I don't know if you could, like, not in grade school. I don't think you could show this in grade school today.
No, I don't think so. I mean, you could. I don't think you should.
I mean, you could show it in high school, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up like the whole shadow play introduction, like that kind of, exposition dump right off the bat. Because having not read The Hobbit or the actual Lord of the Rings trilogy, I needed a little bit of backstory filled in, because otherwise, if you don't do that, I'm like, what the hell is going on with, like, Bilbo is leaving the Shire and with the ring, and everyone's like, I don't know whether they're happy to see him go, or like, tell me this, right? But it reminded me too of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And as Hermione is describing the backstory of the three brothers and the Deathly Hallows, that had to have borrowed from this, because the styles are very, very similar.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because it makes perfect sense, and it hadn't even crossed my mind. I have obviously seen the Harry Potter film, and it is almost exactly the same style, right? They're kind of shadowy. Obviously, the animation is a little more updated now, but I think they definitely would have had to borrow from that. And I think they did it well.
Yeah. Even in, as I mentioned prior to the Ophelia movie, where they had this scene where Hamlet has the actors and they're doing this shadow play to draw out Claudius and to get him to admit to having, his brother killed. Shadow play can work really well in a very abstract storytelling. And right off the bat with this, I'm like, you are instantly setting the mood for what you're about to witness, because it maintains that dark, menacing tone. And the score during the opening credits leaves no guess to this as to what kind of mood you're going down for this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think they nailed it, right? If that was the mood they were trying to set up, which as we've discussed, it was, between the score and the shadow play, I think that was a really strong way to start off the film, right? Get kind of right into it. Tell the viewers, especially if they don't really know what's going on, what's about to happen, what they're about to see, a little bit of backstory, and kind of go right into it.
Yeah. I mean, not knowing really the backstory of some of these characters, I liked the fact that it gave me an introduction to Gollum, because up to this point, and again, I have not read the books, I have not seen the Peter Jackson films, I don't know if that backstory of Gollum is in the Peter Jackson films. You'll have to fill me in on that one.
It is, but it's not until, I mean, the backstory that they show there at the beginning is not till the third of the Return of the King in the Peter Jackson films, where they talk about him actually taking the ring from his friend, whose name is, I believe, Deagle, who was the one who actually found it in the river. So it is in the story, but it's not until, I believe, the extended version of the third film. So unless you've seen that, right, then you really wouldn't see that anywhere else other than here.
It's interesting because Gollum is, at least to my knowledge, such a big part of the Lord of the Rings. Obviously Frodo and Gandalf, and these are the bigger characters. But Gollum is such a big part, at least of the Peter Jackson films, a very iconic part. But it's funny because you spent all this time building up the story of Gollum. We don't really see him much. And then here's the kicker part. It feels like the Frodo Gollum angle of this story kind of gets dropped off in favor for this big fight at the castle. And then we never get a resolution out of this.
Well, and I think a lot of that is in the unfinished, second part, or in the Return of the King version that obviously these guys didn't go on to make, because a lot of the relationship that Frodo ends up having with Gollum, again, I'm referencing the Peter Jackson films or the books, happens, in the second half of the whole story, right? Gollum is a relatively minor character in the first half. If you look at, say, the three books as one story, he's relatively minor in the first half. He's more of a reference. You kind of hear about him. You hear Bilbo talk about him. You hear Gandalf talk about him. He pokes up here and there. And it is a really good relationship that he ends up having with Frodo. and the conflict that he has with Sam. And that's the part that we just didn't get at the end of this film because of where it ended.
Marvel fans will probably agree with me on this one. For years, since the Eternals came out, people were like, is no one going to mention this giant celestial sticking out of the ocean? We finally got the fact that the celestial is still there in Captain America Brave New World. But the end of this film, for anyone who has read the trilogy, is a massive dangling thread that will never get finished. I don't know if you've seen the show Deadly Class. It was actually based on a graphic novel, and they got this first season, and it's a really good first season. And they ended the show literally on like a Mexican standoff cliffhanger, and they got canceled, and they never finished the show. Does this feel like that situation? Like you're wanting more, and even though the last line of the entire film is "so concludes the first part of the Lord of the Rings," like great, you're not going to get a sequel.
No, it does kind of feel like that. I mean, hindsight is 2020, and we now know obviously they didn't get the second part, so it feels a little more cliffhanger like there. But I remember when I was going into this film the first time, I didn't know if it was going to be all done in one or if there was going to be a couple of parts. And I remember kind of getting up to 20 minutes left and seeing where they were at in the story and thinking, all right, they are really going to have to hurry this along if they're going to get to the end. And obviously that isn't what they did, leaving it on the cliffhanger. And I think their goal might have been to set up a cliffhanger, because that is a good way to hook people to come back for the sequel, right? To come back for the next installment. It's just too bad that we never got that, and so the cliffhanger just kind of hangs there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things, and Ralph Bakshi had actually mentioned this in an interview, that had you put The Lord of the Rings Part 1 in the title, I think people would have been in for a sequel. I think it also would have, kind of tied the hands of the studio to say, okay, go do your sequel. And this film made bank, 1978 bank at that too. Like, I get it doesn't necessarily move the needle, but you can't argue with the amount of money it made based on the amount of money they spent.
No, you're right. And it would have made it a little bit easier to get that sequel going, like you just mentioned, right? I think if they had known, and I imagine they would have known going in, this was only going to be part 1 of 2. Putting that part 1 on the top might have helped them get that second film. And again, just speaking as somebody who was coming in relatively blind, I didn't know if it was going to be 1 or 2. So that would have just helped a viewer who hadn't seen the film before as well.
Obviously, nothing can ever be left to just sit. Hollywood has run out of ideas, so they're constantly going back to the well. You take a look at the animation style of this. You take a look at the time it came out. And even though the Lord of the Rings story has now been done in a way that is like Peter Jackson's imagery is just world building, world shaking, world moving. Like, he did so much for the ability to take an iconic series and to bring it to film, that's kind of like this is the benchmark. If you don't look like this, you really should be doing this. But this animation style, coming out at a time when animation was able to, to experiment with different styles, with different looks, with different feels. You weren't pigeonholed into we have to make it so the kid. No, I think today you can still do, maybe not on the cheap rotoscope like it was, but I think you can still do a decent animated Lord of the Rings. Now, I have not watched Lord of the Rings War of the Rohirrim. I'm curious to see how that looks. But if an anime studio wanted to take the original trilogy and do it in a good anime style, do you think there's room for that in today's market?
Absolutely. I think if they did it in a way that was true to the Peter Jackson style, because I mean, I think and I mean fans of all the different fantasy realms and the different fandoms, they cling to the version that they think is the truest. And for Lord of the Rings, it's Peter Jackson, the visuals, the story that he tells. And I think that if an animated version was to, stay true to a lot of the styles, be that the wardrobe or the building styles, and not change too much, but just do what they could to add, maybe cooler action that you couldn't have done in the live action. Although the live action at the time did quite well with that as well. I think there are ways to improve it and tell the story. I worry that nowadays, whenever studios try to remake something, they try to remake it their own, right? And they try to change things, and that's fine. But that's fine if you're trying to draw in new fans who aren't familiar with the story or the product. But if you're trying to continue fans' enjoyment of it who've been enjoying it for 20 years and you change a lot of things, it tends not to make people very happy. So I think if they're going to do it right, they have to stick as much as they can to the Peter Jackson versions and then just add to it instead of, subtract.
I think there's an argument to be able to take or move away from that kind of tentpole, though. I take a look at Star Wars Visions, which was the animated series done on Disney Plus, where each episode in both seasons was done by a different animation studio. Season 1, Episode 1, Star Wars Visions, The Duel, as animated by Kamikaze Duga. This has this very cool black and white, but yet color with the lightsabers kind of style to it that's very almost Japanese samurai hand sketched text kind of. I would love to see that kind of look to Lord of the Rings. Something very not, I don't want it to look like a Pixar film. I don't want it to look like something that is refined and clean. I think there is a room for a little bit of dirt in the animation for this.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be really cool to see, right? Something kind of gritty was the word that kind of came to mind when you were describing that. And I don't know if it's too like something kind of simplistic and gritty, which I think is I haven't seen the Star Wars the bit that you were just referencing there, but that's the image that came to mind when you were describing it as kind of a clean, not too cutesy, simple, simplistic but gritty, and I think that could work quite well.
Yeah, because I mean, if you go too clean, then you run the risk of redoing what Rankin Bass did with The Hobbit, as opposed to what Bakshi Studios did with this. I think the key thing here is that Lord of the Rings, while beloved by people of all ages, it's not necessarily a kid's book.
No, it's not. And I think when you compare it to other kind of fantasy films or series that have come out later, it is more family friendly. I look at the Witcher series that came out, or Game of Thrones, which they're all kind of the fantasy swords and spears type thing. But if you read the books and you look at the story as a whole, no, it is a dark story. It's not a kid friendly story. So finding a way to do it a little darker, I think, would be a way to tell the story a little bit in a way that I think a lot of people would enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, I love the analogy of The Witcher and Game of Thrones / House of the Dragon. Obviously, they didn't shy away from the darkness. Did they pull back a little bit? Yeah, because there's some of the stuff in like Game of Thrones that there's no way that you could put on the screen. I mean, the Red Wedding was bad enough as it was, but the book, I think it goes a little bit further. But I think you can also take a look at different series like Dune. Dune, I think, is a perfect example. Dune is basically like almost in essence like Space Lord of the Rings, because like there is this, Dune is like the halfway point, I think, between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, but in space. Like it's one of those things where look what Denis Villeneuve has done with Dune. You can do that with Lord of the Rings, but in animation style.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I think that there's definitely, if a studio was to pick it up and do it that way, I think there is room for it. I haven't seen War of the Rohirrim earlier, or either. You mentioned it. You mentioned it earlier. I do believe that it's going for a fairly, I can say, traditional kind of anime style that I think a lot of people would be familiar with. I know it's borrowing a lot of the iconography and the wardrobe and the kind of set design from the Peter Jackson film, which I think is a way to keep fans interested. But if a studio was to do it and kind of make it entirely their own, I'd be interested to see it for sure.
Yeah. One example you could lean towards is Zack Snyder's Twilight of the Gods, which is now on Netflix. There's a lot of, there's a lot of darkness in there. There's a lot of sketch, but also take a look at the Castlevania series on Netflix. That's almost a perfect template of what you could do. And I think with a streaming service like Prime Video, because of course they're deep into the Tolkien world with Rings of Power, why don't they approach a studio like one that did Castlevania and bring Lord of the Rings, like the original series there?
Well, I think there's an appetite for it too, right? I think fans want that kind of grittier, darker storytelling, right? It doesn't have to be everything, and there are more family friendly versions of a lot of things. But I think there's definitely an appetite, right? Like the Castlevania that you mentioned, that's quite a popular series, and if a studio like Amazon, who is deep into it, like you said with the Rings of Power, did decide to do something like that, it can be received pretty well.
Oh, absolutely. But I wonder if the appetite is there, though. And let me explain, okay? War of the Rohirrim, which we have been talking about. So we're in the world that we're talking about in animation. I know we don't pay attention to what the critics normally say because that's what this show is all about. But at Rotten Tomatoes, it sits at a 49% tomatometer. But a bigger blight on this is the box office. Because the film had a budget of $30 million. The box office only sits right now at $20.5 million, according to Wikipedia, at the time of recording. So I wonder if this is something that needs to go to streaming as opposed to the box office if you're going to rely on this.
No, I think you're right, absolutely. I mean, I think in general, people aren't maybe going to movie theaters as much as they used to as a whole. But if it were me and I were interested in going to see this, I'd much rather call it up on my Amazon Prime account than actually go out and physically see it somewhere. I think if somebody was going to do it, going straight to streaming would be better.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. These streaming services need to be able to put out, content, right? They need something to put in their coffers, right? But just to put it into perspective, okay? This movie that we're talking about, the 1978 Lord of the Rings, had a 1-week re-release in Australia and still brought in, from one theater in 1 week, $2,318 on the April 21st, 2022 weekend. 2022, when you realize that we're not back to proper box office levels, and Australia was doing this quite a bit, where they were re-releasing films because not a lot of new good movies were coming out to theater and not bringing people in. Here, you're able to take an older film, re-show it, and try to make a little bit more money off of it. In some cases, in movies that we have talked about on this show already, box office takes have been like $12 or $24. This brought in some bank for that 1 week. Not a bad idea, and maybe that's the better indication of what you're looking for. Now, keep in mind, too, this is in Australia. And with Peter Jackson filming a lot of his stuff in New Zealand, there's going to be an appetite there. It remains to be seen. I mean, obviously, we don't need a brand new retelling of the original trilogy, but maybe there's room. And maybe there's a reminder in this film that all animated films don't need to look the same. You can be a little different with your animation and have it stand out. There are a number of films with different animation styles that are jaw-dropping. There's a movie that's on my whiteboard for the show, because it does qualify, called Renaissance. And if you haven't watched it, oh my God, you need to watch it. It is stylistically superb. So here's hoping that maybe there's a lesson in here for studios that you don't have to do the same thing over and over again.
No, absolutely. And I mean, this film certainly did try something new. And I think it's a matter of opinion to decide whether they succeeded or failed. But the fact that they tried something new and kind of went all out with it is clear, and I think is an impressive attempt at the very least.
All right, Matt, we have come to the end of our road here. But now I got to throw it to you. Who is your MVP of 1978's animated The Lord of the Rings?
That's a tough one. I'm gonna have to go with, and I'm blanking on his name right now, so you're gonna have to remind me, the actor who played Aragorn. We discussed him earlier.
Sir John Hurt, and you put the Sir
John
on that.
That absolutely, you have to include that. But I think he's got to be my MVP. Like we talked about earlier, he had probably the biggest role in the film, one of the biggest roles next to maybe Frodo and Gandalf. You know, he was throughout the film, and to pick up such an iconic role, you know, like Aragorn, you know, it still required a lot of effort, a good performance on his part, and I think he did a great job with it.
Absolutely. The late, great Sir John Hurt. Not my MVP, though. From the voice cast, he's my MVP. But my overall MVP, and we did mention him a little bit, Leonard Rosenman, who is the composer of the score for this film, because let's be honest, right off the bat, this score told you exactly what you're going to get. And it's this is an epic score. Like, that's the thing people have to realize. While the voice cast of this film is a great, fantastic radio play cast, the score elevates everything. So anything you may think about the animation, anything you may think about, you know, the solarization of black and white footage versus the rotoscoping versus like the nightmare fuel of some of these characters, this score is epic.
It is. I have to agree. And I mean, I'm handicapped a little bit because I look at it through the lens of having obviously been raised on the Peter Jackson films and you know, Howard Shore and the score in those ones. But if I kind of train myself to forget about that and look at this as its own piece, it was epic, right? And those parts where I was kind of closing my eyes and just enjoying what I was hearing, you know, the music would swell during the battle scenes, and it told a really good story, and it sounded fantastic.
Just to put things into perspective, Leonard Rosenman did actually use one or two pieces of this score for when he also did Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. So let me put that into perspective. He received an Academy Award nomination for Best Score for Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. And if little bits and little nuances of this score made it into that tells you exactly how good this score was. Matt, thank you so much for this. Now, please let our listeners know where they can find you out there on the interwebs.
So I'm on Instagram at Matt B. Larter. And I mean, that's about all I'm at right now. But I hope to have a little bit more of a presence as I kind of grow myself online. So that's where you can find me right now on Instagram.
You know we're going to bring you back for this, right?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. I'd love to be.
Start thinking of films, because we'll get you back on sooner rather than later. Matt, thank you so much. And dear listeners, well, you guys know the drill. If there is a movie out there that you think is unfairly maligned or is so bad that there's no way in the Shire that we can find anything good to say about it, hit us up on social media at NotThatBadCast, or go to our website at NotThatBadCast.com. And while you're there, make sure you check out our merch section, because we got a bunch of cool stuff for you guys to buy so you can help support the show. Until next time, he's Matt, I'm Jay. You guys are awesome. This is It's Not That Bad, a proud member of the Pantheon Podcast Network. Take care.